The deafening roar of incoming mortar shells shook the concrete floor of the prep kitchen, rattling the heavy steel pans on the wall as red dust rained down into the bubbling vats of powdered eggs. Through the shattered high windows of the mess hall, I watched a plume of black smoke rise over the eastern ridge, precisely where the 400 men who had laughed at my greasy apron just 2 hours ago were now pinned down in a rocky kill zone. My radio, clipped to the belt of my oversized tactical pants under a flour-dusted apron, erupted into a chaotic symphony of screaming voices, heavy machine gun fire, and the frantic pleas of a platoon leader watching his men get torn apart piece by piece. They had no idea that the quiet woman scraping burnt bacon off their trays was the only operator on this entire base who knew the exact wind elevation needed to kill the sniper holding them hostage. The captain smashed his fist onto the tactical console, screaming for air support that was not coming, while I reached under the flour sack beneath the prep counter and pulled out a matte black Pelican case containing a customized precision rifle that officially did not exist. My hands did not shake as I stripped off the stained apron, but as I racked the heavy bolt and looked up at the sheer limestone peak looming over the burning valley, I realized that taking this shot would not only save 400 dying men, but it would also instantly reveal my burnt identity to the very enemies who had put $1 million bounty on my head. The sweltering heat inside FOB Griffin was a constant suffocating presence that clung to everything, mixing with the sharp odors of cheap bleach, scorched coffee, and diesel exhaust. For 7 long months, my reality had been defined by 300 stainless steel trays, endless sacks of dehydrated potatoes, and the rhythmic clatter of heavy aluminum pots in the mess hall. To the 400 men who passed through my serving line every morning, I was simply Callahan, the quiet contractor with dust-smeared cheeks, oversized fatigues, and hair tied back in a messy bun. They saw a woman who wiped down dirty tables and mopped tracked-in mud, completely oblivious to the fact that my hands had been shaped by years of intense special warfare training long before they ever held a ladle. My presence at this remote outpost on the edge of the Devil's Anvil was the result of a quiet and desperate compromise. Following a deep-cover strike in the mountains of Yemen that went disastrously wrong due to a high-level intelligence leak, my true name and face had been compromised across global terror networks. With an exorbitant bounty placed on my head and naval intelligence scrambling to erase my digital footprint, my former commanding officer made the radical decision to bury me in plain sight. Grounding me at a desk in Virginia would have invited scrutiny, but assigning me as a civilian culinary contractor at an isolated forward operating base kept me entirely off the tactical grid. Living under a false identity required an absolute suppression of instinct and muscle memory. Every single day was a calculated performance designed to project harmless incompetence. When Chief Petty Officer Thomas Hayes slammed his tray onto the metal counter before dawn, complaining loudly about burnt bacon and making crude jokes about civilian contractors, I learned to keep my eyes lowered and my voice soft. When Lieutenant Bradley Walsh barked orders about hot coffee while checking his wrist-mounted GPS, I forced myself to pretend I did not recognize the tactical vulnerabilities in his team's perimeter layout. I watched their movements with the trained eye of a sniper, noticing frayed rifle slings, improper bootlaces, and subtle limps that revealed hidden injuries. Yet I said nothing. The tension within the base had been building for weeks as intelligence reports pointed toward a massive subterranean bunker complex hidden deep within the Shora Gorge. The target was a ruthless bomb maker known only as the Engineer, the man responsible for hundreds of roadside improvised explosive devices across the sector. Operation Desert Hammer was designed to be a decisive, overwhelming strike, drawing every available operator from the base into a synchronized push through the narrow canyon. On the morning of the assault, the mess hall was packed with nervous energy, the air thick with the smell of gun oil and sweat, as 400 men prepared to move out into the barren hills. As the massive convoy of armored vehicles rolled out through the main gates, leaving FOB Griffin silent and nearly deserted, a strange, heavy stillness settled over the base. Only a skeletal guard force and a handful of radio operators remained behind to monitor the communications net. I spent the morning scrubbing greasy baking sheets, listening to the rhythmic hum of the base generators, while my mind constantly calculated the dropping barometric pressure and the shifting wind speeds rattling the tin roof of the kitchen. A massive dust storm was building to the north, an environmental factor that had been entirely overlooked in the morning tactical brief. My worst fears were realized when I walked into the Tactical Operations Center to drop off a fresh pot of coffee for the skeleton crew on duty. The radio consoles were screaming with frantic overlapping voices, punctuated by the deafening staccato of heavy machine gun fire and concussive rocket detonations. Lieutenant Walsh's arrogant composure was completely gone, replaced by raw terror as he reported that the entire strike force had walked into a meticulously prepared horseshoe ambush. The enemy had held the high ground on both sides of the gorge, pinning 400 operators inside a narrow rock funnel where their armor was useless and their escape routes were completely blocked. The situation turned catastrophic within minutes, as the radio operator confirmed that the incoming sandstorm had grounded all air support from the regional air base, leaving the pinned-down troops entirely on their own. Over the radio speakers, Chief Hayes's voice broke through the chaos, reporting that an elevated enemy heavy-caliber sniper on the opposite ridge had just taken out their designated marksman, systematically picking off anyone who tried to maneuver. Without air cover, artillery support, or counter-sniper capability, the 400 men trapped in the valley were facing total annihilation, their survival ticking down by the second. I set the coffee pot down, turned away from the panicked operators in the control room, and walked back to the kitchen with absolute icy focus. Entering my small windowless sleeping quarters behind the pantry, I locked the heavy wooden door, dropped to my knees, and pried open the loose floorboards under my cot. Deep inside the foundation lay the black pelican case I had sworn never to touch unless my life was directly threatened. I popped the heavy latches, revealing the custom-suppressed long-range precision rifle nestled in custom foam, along with specialized match-grade ammunition, a wind meter, and my original military credentials. Stripping off the grease-stained apron and baggy civilian clothes, I pulled on desert camouflage fatigues, laced up my combat boots, and threw a lightweight ghillie hood over my head. I loaded 3 specialized magazines, hearing the crisp, metallic click that had echoed through my life for over a decade. Slipping out through the rear exit of the kitchen while the remaining base personnel were clustered around the radios, I began a grueling vertical ascent up the sheer limestone spire known as the Watchtower, a treacherous peak directly behind the base that offered an absolute top-down view of the Devil's Anvil 2,000 feet below. The climb was a brutal endurance test, the sun-baked rock tearing at my hands as the 20-pound rifle strapped to my back threatened to pull me off the cliff face with every gust of wind. My lungs burned in the thinning air, but my mind remained completely detached, processing wind vector math, thermal updrafts, and target geometry. Reaching the narrow summit after 30 minutes of continuous climbing, I crawled on my stomach through the sun-baked shale, deploying the bipod near the edge of the precipice and looking down into the smoking hell of the canyon. Through the high-magnification optics of my rifle scope, the scene below was a chaotic nightmare of burning vehicles and pinned operators, huddled behind boulders under relentless fire. Scanning the jagged ridgeline nearly a mile away, I spotted the subtle glint of glass hidden deep inside a shaded cave mouth on Ankle Breaker Ridge, the exact location of the enemy sniper who was holding 400 men at bay. The distance was over 1,700 yards, with unpredictable crosswinds swirling through the canyon and thermal waves distorting the sight picture. I calculated the Coriolis effect, adjusted the elevation turrets, slowed my heart rate down to a steady rhythm, and placed my finger on the light 3-pound trigger. As I gently squeezed the trigger to release the suppressed bullet into the howling wind, a sudden shift in the gravel directly behind me made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. The cold steel barrel of a heavy pistol pressed hard against the back of my skull before I could even blink, the iron sight biting into my scalp as a rough hand grabbed the collar of my ghillie hood. A low guttural curse in an Eastern European accent rasped right in my ear, telling me not to move a single muscle unless I wanted my brains painted across the limestone. A four-man team of Chechen mercenaries had used the chaotic noise of the valley ambush to scale the blind northern face of the peak, hunting for whoever was coordinating radio overwatch from the heights. They had not expected to find a lone woman lying on a ledge with a specialized precision rifle, but their lead fighter did not hesitate, shifting his weight to drive a combat knife downward into my neck. Instinct took over before my conscious mind could process the terror. I drove my elbow backward into his kneecap with everything I had, feeling the joint shatter with a sickening crunch as his grip on my hood slipped. Rolling hard across the sharp shale, I drew my secondary sidearm from its hidden chest holster, firing 3 rapid rounds from my back into his chest before his companions could react. The second mercenary lunged forward, swinging the heavy wooden stock of his assault rifle directly at my head. I raised my left forearm to block the crushing strike, hearing a hairline fracture snap in my arm as blinding pain shot up to my shoulder, but I used the momentum to drive my tactical blade upward into his exposed throat. The remaining 2 fighters tackled me simultaneously, pinning my broken arm against the burning rock as we tumbled dangerously close to the sheer 2,000-foot drop. The weight of a 200-pound killer pressed down on my chest, his hand crushing my windpipe while his partner reached for a dropped grenade on the gravel. Choking for air, with vision darkening at the edges, I remembered the merciless hand-to-hand drills of my early elite training, where strength meant nothing compared to leverage and leverage meant survival. I hooked my heel behind his ankle, bucked my hips with violent force, and flipped us both over the edge of the rocky ledge, slamming his spine into a jagged boulder while grabbing the second man's belt to drag him down with us into the abyss below. Blood filled my mouth, and my fractured arm hung completely useless at my side, but the fight on the peak was over, leaving 3 bodies motionless on the rocks and the 4th tumbling into the void. Dragging my battered body back across the blood-slicked stone to where my rifle lay untouched, I forced myself to ignore the agonizing throb in my arm and the nausea rising in my throat. Down in the canyon, the radio on my harness was crackling with pure desperation as Chief Hayes shouted that their ammunition was nearly depleted and they were preparing a final suicidal bayonet charge against the fortified bunker doors. With only my right hand and my teeth, I cleared the jammed chamber of my precision rifle, propped the heat-warped barrel onto a flat rock, and pressed my eye back against the rubber optic casing. The heavy enemy sniper on Ankle Breaker Ridge was back on his gun, lining up his crosshairs directly on Lieutenant Walsh's exposed helmet as the trapped platoon made their desperate push. I took a ragged breath, allowed my heart rate to drop into the quiet space between agonizing beats, and squeezed the trigger. The heavy, suppressed round tore through the mile of swirling dust, hitting the enemy marksman precisely through his optic lens a split second before he could pull his own trigger. Through the high-magnification optics of my precision rifle, I watched the immediate wave of shock ripple through the canyon as the heavy-caliber fire from Ankle Breaker Ridge fell instantly silent. The trapped team below did not hesitate for a single second, surging forward through the swirling dust and smoke to lay heavy breaching charges against the reinforced steel doors of the subterranean complex. Down in the valley, Chief Hayes grabbed his tactical radio, calling out into the open frequency to thank the unknown marksman who had just saved 400 lives from certain slaughter. I could hear his voice cracking over my harness speaker, asking for a call sign or a unit designation. But I kept my thumb far away from the transmit button while racking another heavy match-grade cartridge into the smoking chamber. The fight was far from over because the remaining insurgent fighters inside the gorge realized their Overwatch sniper had been eliminated, sparking a wave of desperate violence across the canyon walls. 2 fortified heavy machine gun nests on the eastern ridge roared to life, chewing up the shale inches from where Lieutenant Walsh and his men were setting their charges. Working with only my right arm while propping the heavy barrel against the sun-baked stone, I adjusted my holdover for the shifting crosswinds, controlled my ragged breathing, and squeezed the trigger twice in rapid succession. The massive kinetic rounds tore through the fortified sandbags, neutralizing both gunners before they could detonate the command-wired explosives buried along the main approach route. Down below, the breaching charges ignited with an earth-shaking roar, blowing the massive bunker doors inward and allowing the Allied assault force to flood the subterranean complex to capture the target. As the sound of close-quarters combat echoed from inside the underground tunnels, a sudden wave of ice-cold nausea washed over me, accompanied by a blinding flash of light behind my eyelids. Blood was pooling beneath my chest from the severe lacerations on my shoulder, and the hairline fracture in my left arm radiated an agonizing heat that threatened to drag me into unconsciousness. I dragged my battered body away from the cliff edge, attempting to field strip my rifle so its specialized components would not fall into enemy hands if another squad reached the summit. My trembling fingers could barely operate the takedown pins, and my vision narrowed into a dark tunnel as the sheer physical toll of the climb and the brutal knife fight crushed my remaining strength. As I managed to slip the receiver into the foam lining of the Pelican case, the distinct sound of heavy tactical boots crunching on the gravel directly behind me shattered the stillness of the peak. I reached blindly for my sidearm on the rock, but my fingers lacked the strength to lift the heavy frame, leaving me completely defenseless on the bare stone. A shadow fell over my bleeding face, and I looked up through blurred eyes to see the dark silhouette of a man standing over me with his weapon raised, his thumb slowly clicking the safety off as he aimed directly between my eyes. The hum of the evacuation helicopter's rotors was the last thing I remembered before the blackness finally pulled me under. When I woke up 2 days later, the harsh glare of fluorescent lights bled through my eyelids. I was lying in a narrow bed in the base's secure medical ward, the air smelling sharply of antiseptic and fresh linen rather than grease and dried blood. My left arm was bound tightly in a rigid fiberglass cast, and a neat row of dark sutures held the jagged bullet graze on my shoulder together. Captain Miller was sitting silently in a metal folding chair beside the bed, holding a thick leather-bound folder bearing a crimson classified stamp. When he saw my eyes open, he did not offer a formal speech or a dramatic salute. He simply set the folder on my tray table and leaned forward, his tired eyes reflecting a deep, quiet respect. The military intelligence apparatus had worked at light speed while I was unconscious. The digital footprint that had once left me exposed to international bounties had been thoroughly scrubbed, replaced by an ironclad, top-tier security clearance that officially recorded my presence at FOB Griffin as a specialized tactical advisor rather than a culinary contractor. The engineer was in federal custody, his network dismantled, and the ambush that should have slaughtered 400 men had turned into a decisive victory for our task force. 3 weeks later, the physical wounds had begun to heal into thin silver scars, and the day arrived for me to depart FOB Griffin for a permanent assignment as a master marksmanship instructor at Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado. I dressed in crisp, tailored fatigues, pinning the golden trident securely above my left pocket for the first time in years. I didn't need to hide behind baggy civilian clothes or grease-stained aprons any longer. The quiet performance of playing helpless was over, not because I sought glory, but because I had reclaimed my true place without compromise. Before the transport vehicle arrived to take me to the airstrip, I walked through the heavy wooden doors of the mess hall one last time to collect my few remaining personal items from the back room. The sweltering kitchen was filled with the familiar smell of hot coffee and sizzling breakfast rations, but as the screen door slammed shut behind me, the loud chatter inside the crowded room died instantly. 400 operators, Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, and hardened paramilitaries stopped mid-sentence. Every single man in that room stood up in complete, absolute silence. There were no cheers, no rowdy applause, and no exaggerated fanfare. Instead, 400 battle-hardened veterans stood at attention, their eyes fixed on me with a profound, unspoken reverence that no medal or official commendation could ever match. Lieutenant Walsh, standing near the serving counter where he had once barked demands for coffee, stepped forward. The sharp, arrogant edge in his posture was entirely gone, replaced by a quiet, deep humility. He looked at the golden trident on my chest, then into my eyes, and offered a slow, respectful nod of his head, a silent acknowledgement of the debt he and his men owed to the woman they had once ignored. Chief Petty Officer Thomas Hayes walked out from behind the prep line holding a steaming mug of fresh black coffee. He set it down gently on the counter before me, his massive frame straightening as he looked at me with a faint, knowing smile. He didn't make a joke about burnt bacon or cheap rations. He simply gestured to the mug and spoke softly. "Watch your footing in Coronado, Callahan," Hayes said, his deep voice carrying through the quiet room. "Winds can be tricky on the coast." I picked up the mug, took a slow sip of the scalding liquid, and looked around the room at the men whose lives were still whole because I had chosen to step out of the shadows. My ultimate victory was never about violent revenge against the enemies who had hunted me, nor was it about proving my worth to men who had underestimated me. It was about the absolute restoration of my own personal boundaries, my professional dignity, and the unbreakable internal peace that comes from knowing exactly who you are, no matter what uniform or apron the world expects you to wear.